All right, so I think we're got a good group here, and I think we're ready to get started. So I'll give a little bit of intro first, then we can kind of get more into the details. So hi everyone, good to see you all at the town hall. Just for a quick background, we're DK and Mishti from the Highlighter team, and we're building Highlighter as a place to gather to read and discuss great writing. The town halls are a way to bring writers into the mix to jam with us and dig deeper on the ideas. And we've recently been doing a few sessions with more deeply researched blog pieces and the authors of those. So this is a great example of that, because Jason's work is on the relationship between science and invention and how it relates to human progress. He's done tons of writing. I'm sure you've sort of read the pre-required reading, but there's also a lot more on his blog. So he's just explored this topic in a lot of depth.
Yeah, and I think the topic is deeply important, and it's kind of refreshing to step back and think about, because I mean, Jason, as you've written, to care about progress is really to care about human flourishing and human happiness. And I think it is a moral imperative. And I'm really grateful that through your work, you kind of remind us not to take it for granted and to think hard about like what are the social and cultural and economic conditions that can really enable scientific and technological progress. So I'm really excited to dig into all that.
Great, me too.
So quick note on the format here. The magic of the town hall is when we do keep it really participatory. So do chime in with ideas and questions on chat, and you can chat anything you want, participate over there, and then we'll welcome you up if you want to add your question or thought to the live conversation. Just as a bit of housekeeping to let you know, we are recording the session and we're streaming it live to YouTube. So we'll make it into a video, do some post-production. It'll be an asset that can live out for other people who couldn't attend us tonight, but who still want to learn from Jason's thinking and from our discussion.
Awesome. So in the spirit of getting everyone involved, we kind of started chiming in about this earlier, but I wanted to ask everyone to mention an inventor, a story of an inventor or scientist that they might have been inspired by, or any good writing or books that you've read in this general area of progress studies.
So feel free to do that in the chat. And then by way of intro, I would like to start telling you a little bit about Jason. So I was thinking back to when I first met Jason, and I realized that we just crossed our 10-year friendiversary.
Great.
So Jason was working on a brand new startup, and we connected about that, and we got a chance to talk about what he was working on. And sort of, I've watched Jason kind of as a practitioner, as an inventor, as a engineering leader at many interesting Silicon Valley companies. So now you may know him as the author of The Roots of Progress, but he also was co-founder and CEO of Fieldbook, which was a hybrid spreadsheet database. He'd been an engineering manager at Flexport, Amazon, and Groupon. And he was a co-founder and early employee at other startups. But now he's known for kind of the progress studies, and particularly the program, The Roots of Progress. He's also a part-time advisor and technical consultant to Our World in Data, an Oxford-based nonprofit for research and data on global development. So I think it's interesting that Jason's career has spanned both kind of the practical and the applied, as well as now he's zoomed out to ask kind of some of the bigger questions. And so I think it's like a great starting point to learn more about how that process worked for you and how you thought about kind of navigating to where you are today. And of course, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me here. Yeah, it's funny to be going through sort of like a big midlife career shift. For almost 20 years, I was in the tech industry and assumed I would just sort of always be there. Loved it. Still do love it. I miss coding, by the way. Every once in a while, I get to do a little bit and it's fun. And product development and so forth. I still have a toe in those waters with Our World in Data. That's actually what I help them with. I'm kind of their part-time engineering manager, essentially. And that's been great. That team is great. And if you haven't checked out the site Our World in Data, by the way, okay, great. Misty just put the link in there. It is a great resource, especially in the last several months. It's become one of the best resources on coronavirus data. So definitely check it out. Yeah, and then I started The Roots of Progress as a hobby over 3 years ago. It was just a side project. It was literally, it was a reading list at first, actually. It was just what books am I going to read next? it would be interesting to read about the Industrial Revolution. It would be interesting to learn about the story of human progress. And I kind of got really ambitious with it and started off on my reading. And a few months in and a few books in, I decided to start blogging about it, just as a way to write some notes on what I was reading and kind of help my intellectual development. And I really didn't care in the beginning who read the blog. I had, for the first couple of years, I had maybe 50, people on my email list or something. And then last summer, I guess summer last year, so a little over a year ago now, a couple things happened at once. So one, I wrote a blog post that went viral, hit #1 on Hacker News and kind of went viral from there and got really popular. That was one of the ones that you all linked to. It was called "Why Did We Wait So Long for the Bicycle?" It was kind of an analysis of the invention of the bicycle, the story of the invention of the bicycle, and also why did we not have the bicycle until the 1800s? Why weren't there bicycles in like the Roman Empire, or, something like that? You can kind of imagine that they might have been invented centuries or millennia earlier. So that took off and kind of started to get me an audience. Then about 2 weeks after that, Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison wrote this article in The Atlantic that kicked off this whole notion of progress studies. They called for a, quote, a new science of progress, a new field or a sort of interdisciplinary area of progress studies. And all of a sudden, there was, like, progress studies was suddenly a thing. It was a community that, just kind of sprang to life. I think there were a bunch of, I don't know, there was something in the air. There were a bunch of people already interested in this topic or thinking about it from this angle. And when Cowen and Collison published that article, it just kind of galvanized a movement. And all of a sudden there was like a Slack group for it. And there was, there were people blogging about it and so forth. So, and I was kind of just like thrust right into the middle of it because I had already been writing about progress for a couple of years. And then independently of all that, I decided it was time to move on from my job and find something new to do. And I realized that rather than get another job in the tech industry, even though there were some really interesting opportunities out there, the thing I wanted to do more than anything else was to just keep writing the blog. And so with some help from Tyler Cowen's fund called Emergent Ventures, where he writes checks for projects that he thinks is interesting, and some other grants from some effective altruist funds, I went full-time on this about almost a year ago, and have been, writing and blogging and speaking ever since.
That's great. I think it's a great story for a bunch of reasons. One is we've had a lot of bloggers and newsletter writers kind of in our network, so we've talked to, and everybody has like a different path, but a lot of it does start off a little bit of like a hobby or something that you just kind of do organically because you have energy for it, which does remind me a lot of some of these, some of these scientists that you reference who have the flexibility to work on something out of passion or interest, and then it sort of graduates up to more serious over time. So it's almost like you've gone from hobbyist to more professional as the energy took you there. So I think it's a super interesting kind of parallel. But then I think the newsletter as a career profession is starting to emerge as something that people understand and has, it's obviously still early. But I think, I'm intrigued by what you're doing because I think it's more than, in a sense, just a newsletter. There's coursework and there's like a kind of a more formal educational program behind it too, if I understand correctly. So can you talk a little bit about what that is?
So there's a couple of things that have happened. So mainly this summer, I created a high school course in the history of technology called, we ended up calling it Progress Studies for Young Scholars. It was run over the summer as a summer program. It is now being continued into the fall as like an after-school program. So that was really kind of a joint project between myself and a private school called Higher Ground Education. Higher Ground is the largest operator of Montessori schools in the United States. They also have a high school brand called the Academy of Thought and Industry that has a handful of locations and now an online virtual school. And they've been obviously shifting to virtual education, with COVID. So the folks who run that school, I have known them for like 10 or 20 years, and deep respect for them and the team and what they're doing. And so we've kind of been looking for an excuse to work together ever since I went full-time on Progress. And they reached out to me in like end of April and said, hey, how would you like to put together a progress course, a high school, thing? And I thought that was a great idea. So that was what I ended up doing for the summer. Along the way, when we announced it, the number one kind of response we got was, well, hey, can adults join? Or will you have a program for adults? And so we decided to put something together for this fall, which we're calling the Study Group for Progress. So it's like you get all the material that I did for the high school program, plus sort of more advanced adult level readings in the history, economics, and philosophy of progress. And we're actually having a bunch of professors come in and some other guest speakers sort of come in. And so every week we'll have a different guest to do Q&A, and we'll assign reading from that author ahead of time. So you can read actually, maybe like an academic paper on progress, and then the next weekend actually ask questions of the author. So it's a pretty cool opportunity and is starting on Sunday. So if anybody is interested, get in now.
Awesome. So we should have a link in the chat. We'll
absolutely.
that out.
Yeah, we can send that out. I thought your 3 pieces were amazing. And I actually wanted to sort of pivot and ask you a little bit about, you talk about basically this relationship between discovery and invention and when they can exist symbiotically, and how often the most successful people like Pasteur you talked about kind of are flexible and switch between both. So I was wondering about the best examples of this that you see today in like either a corporate lab environment or university environment. Like, where is this happening successfully? Where are the incentives kind of structured right? Or is that an open area you're thinking about?
That's a great question. And I know less about contemporary examples because I've been studying so many of the historical examples. Maybe I should, especially for anybody who maybe didn't get to read some of the posts, let me say a little bit more about this and about some things that I haven't written about, especially kind of related to like the linear model of innovation. So in general, there's this sort of model of innovation that thinks of it like kind of like a pipeline, almost like a waterfall process of like, first we have science and we figure out, laws of the universe in the science phase, right? And then those laws are sort of, passed off to technology, invention, engineering, and that's where we make, cool new things. And then once we have an invention, then it goes to sort of the business side, and then we have distribution and kind of scale up, right? So you can, so sort of like science, invention, distribution, right? Or discovery engineering, something like that, right? You can think of, and people split things into different phases. Like sometimes you hear basic versus applied research, or even basic, engineering versus applied, or development, research versus development, those kinds of things. But you get the general idea. Mm-hmm. In the kind of like so you can, if I want to step back and really caricature this sort of linear model, and exaggerate some of the features that I think are actually not quite in tune with reality, then it would be something like this. Well, scientists pursue just like pure science completely for its own sake. They are driven completely by curiosity about the world, and they have no thought of applications or uses of their science. They aren't driven by that at all, and they have to just kind of work completely in a bubble and and do their science. And then once science is discovered and we have a law of nature, then it is sort of deductively applied to human needs and applications. The engineers just sort of take what was figured out by the scientists, and they just use those laws of nature to like figure out how to design an invention. It's completely just an application of previously discovered principles, and then that invention can go on and get distributed through some business, right? And you can imagine a similar kind of waterfall style handoff. Sorry, my camera just got fuzzy again, didn't it? Let me take a quick fix on that. You can imagine some sort of waterfall style handoff also there from the inventions. Like first you come up with the invention, and then once the invention exists, now you make a business out of it, and then you scale it up. Okay. So again, I'm sort of caricaturing or like parodying this. Obviously, like the real world doesn't work that way. if anybody, for anybody who's involved in like I called it a waterfall model. For anybody who's been involved in the waterfall model of software engineering or more generally of product development, you know that even like a strict waterfall model doesn't work even within product development, where you go from like requirements to design to engineering and so forth. If nothing else, there's sort of a lot of overlap between the stages, and there's a lot of back and forth, right? There's a lot of cycling. And so we see the same thing in general in the innovation pipeline. So scientists do not pursue pure knowledge purely in a bubble, right? Some knowledge certainly is pursued just like totally on the basis of curiosity, or on the basis of maybe we have no idea how this knowledge is going to ever exactly lead to applications, but it seems like it's generally in an important area, right? Tons of stuff that we study about biology, right? How does this random weird organism do its random weird thing, right? How do these bacteria evolve? How does these, how to coral, organisms form colonies, all sorts of things where it's like, well, how, sure, maybe we learn how this bird glows in the dark or something, but how does that help anybody? And yet, we sort of know at a very high level that if we do study enough about, like, biology at the highest level is very relevant to us. We are biological organisms. The more we learn about biology, eventually, somehow, some of it ought to be relevant to health and disease and, and so forth. Not to mention agriculture and, et cetera. So scientists are not always, the scientists are sometimes essentially driven by curiosity or what seems important to human knowledge. But very often, they actually do have ideas and they do have applications in mind. And, Louis Pasteur is maybe one of the greatest and really clearest examples of this. Pasteur was someone who, some of his greatest scientific discoveries came about while he was consulting for like the wine and beer industry of France. Literally, his job at the time was to help with their fermentation processes. And in doing so, he discovered like fundamental things about microbiology. He basically discovered anaerobic metabolism and the role of microbes in fermentation. And so there's this fundamental scientific breakthrough that came from essentially industrial optimization. Similarly, some of the first bacterial diseases that he diagnosed were not in humans, but were in silkworms. So again, he was consulting for industry and trying to help the efficiency and productivity of an industry, a very economic concern. And here he is like discovering, like along the way, discovering these very fundamental things in microbiology. And then another thing that we see is that it is not at all the case that inventions are just like pure, straightforward applications of known, previously established scientific principles. Very often what we find is that inventors are tinkering at the edges of what is known. They are taking science. Yes, inventions are absolutely very often based on science, but just because they're based on science doesn't mean that they are a simple application of known principles. Very often, inventors, if they have a scientific bent, are actually discovering new, maybe not fundamental laws, but like new variations on laws or new situations where new equations need to apply. Or if they are not particularly scientific, or sometimes even if they are, they come up with an invention that works on principles that nobody yet understands. And so what actually happens then is that sometimes further science is motivated literally by understanding the invention and why it even works. And in fact, sometimes the process of invention can create new situations, new physical setups, or new phenomena that scientists never thought to create in the lab. So one of the great stories of this maybe is the invention of the transistor. And I think, and maybe this was told in one of the blog posts that was linked, but the transistor was invented in the 1940s at Bell Labs in their semiconductor research group. Semiconductor physics, some of semiconductor physics had been established at the time and was the motivation and the basis for creating a semiconductor group in the first place. But it turned out that the group that invented the transistor actually needed to push the state of the art in semiconductor physics. They needed to push the boundaries and actually develop new physics. Because when they started putting together their first prototypes of a transistor or started experimenting with it, basically it wasn't behaving the way that the physics said that it ought to. And so they literally had to go back to the drawing board and figure out, okay, maybe we don't know all the physics here. And there was a whole new theory that was created, a theory of surface states, that the electrons at the surface, or the charge or the electric field at the surface of the material, was behaving differently from in the center. And so, that coming up with that theory helped them understand the experiments they were doing, and then led them back to the experimental bench to create another attempt at the transistor, and so forth. And they actually shuttled back and forth between kind of science and invention, and then they would do some practical experiments with a machine, or with actually trying to build a working transistor, and then they would go back to the science to try to explain what they were seeing on the bench, and then they would go back to the bench and try to build another, right? And they did that a few times. So I think the linear model of innovation, like, there is something fundamentally right about it, in that it is true in a certain sense that invention is very often based on science. We could not have had the transistor if we had not identified the phenomenon of semiconductors, right? And that was a physics discovery. We could not have invented the steam engine if we had not first identified the fact of air pressure, the fact that air has weight and that it exerts pressure. We could not have, gone and done the things that Pasteur did in microbiology without, some previous, understanding that, say, single-celled organisms existed, and that cells were even a thing, and so forth. But it's just not nearly as kind of simple and clean and linear and like waterfall handoff style as we might mistakenly think if we don't look carefully at the details. There's much more of there's really interesting friction at the boundaries of science, invention, and business, like scale up, and there's a lot of like cycling, back and forth, and a lot of feedback in the process.
So it almost sounds like on the long arc of history, you can kind of imagine the linearity to it, but at the micro, there's a lot more kind of noise in the signal.
There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of cycling. There's a lot of feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a lack of like environment where you think that's happening right now? In some of your blog posts, you kind of talk about like, let's bring back these corporate invention labs. Like, is there a dearth of spaces, and why is that? And how should we kind of think about creating those environments?
Yeah, and I don't know if bring back the corporate research labs is the right answer, although it's certainly a tempting answer. So there is this interesting thing that's happened over the course of the 20th century, especially pre and post World War II. So there, in the early 20th century was like the heyday of great corporate research labs. So you had the big chemical companies like Dow and DuPont. You had Eastman Kodak doing research. You had Bell Labs, of course, which I just mentioned. And then a little later, in sort of mid-century, you had Xerox PARC. And you have all of these, companies doing, of course, in the late 19th century, you have Edison's research lab. Edison actually created multiple research labs in the course of his career, specialized in different things. And so General Electric, you had the car companies and so forth. So you had a lot of different, sort of research labs doing these, these kind of different things. And it's amazing, actually, how much they contributed in terms of fundamental science. Like they were not just coming up with new inventions and new products. They were actually contributing at a fundamental science level, breaking ground in chemistry. DuPont, for instance, was doing really fundamental science in polymers. And this is like their polymer research is part of what led them to the invention of nylon, which was one of the biggest, developments in plastics. Eastman Kodak was doing like fundamental stuff in chemistry and optics, and so forth, right? Bell Labs is basically where information theory was invented. Like these people were like these corporate labs were getting Nobel Prizes. I mean, the researchers there were, doing like Nobel Prize worthy stuff. And then in the mid 20th century, there was, sort of a generally acknowledged decline of corporate research. Not as much investment into it. It wasn't as fundamental and as long-term, and not as much stuff has seemed to have come out of it. At the same time, and it's unclear to me whether this is a coincidence or whether it's related, but post World War II, the federal government took a much larger role in the funding of research in general. There was relatively little federal funding for research pre-World War II, and then with World War II, they really ramped up defense research, and then post World War II, that kind of got transitioned into civilian research, and we got much more funding we got the creation of the NSF, we got much more funding for like NIH and so forth. And today NIH has a budget of $40 billion and is the largest funder of life science academic research in the world. More than half of life sciences research funding, academic research funding, I think, comes from NIH. Although there's a lot invested by pharma companies as well, but more than half the academic stuff comes from NIH. So it's and there are some arguments that the research, sort of basically the science and the invention and maybe the business and distribution have become more separate and less connected, and that maybe this is a problem. So in the corporate research lab, you had pretty fundamental science very closely connected to the engineering. Again, sometimes it was literally the same people doing both. And that could very easily be handed off to product development. And then you have a business, a parent company there just waiting to take products and scale them up and expand them and distribute. And today, if more of the fundamental science goes on in universities, like how does it make it out into the real world? And what are the incentives, for that to even happen? There is a process now called tech transfer where, university research labs patent things, and then the universities amass these patent portfolios, and then they try to sell them or license them to companies that might be interested in actually doing something with it. But there's just much more of a disconnect, and maybe even like a culture gap, in between academia and corporate, the corporate side, the business side, including startups. And so I don't have a settled opinion on this, but I think it's very plausible that that disconnect has been bad for innovation.
So we've got actually a question from the audience from Max that I think might be an interesting one to probe on a little bit here, because we've looked at like some of these historical examples and kind of the post-World War, but like what if we were to sort of launch up to the modern era a bit? Max, did you want to join us?
Sure. Sorry, I was actually having a bad hair day, so here I am. But how would you say that the Bell Labs, the Xerox Parks, differ from the Google and Facebook moonshots of today? The ones that are creating Loon and taking these shots that might not be plausible 10 years ago, let's say.
Yeah. I mean, I think corporate research still is going on today. Google seems like one of the more just anecdotally seems like maybe one of the more ambitious and impressive research labs, at least within ML, in terms of like what they're actually contributing and breakthroughs they're making and papers they're publishing and so forth. So, it may not be that there are no impressive corporate research labs, but it may be one of these things where it's just like, if you add it all up, maybe there were, half a dozen or a dozen really big, impressive ones back in like the 1930s. And today, maybe we're down to like one or two. So it might just be, not a complete stoppage, but just sort of a matter of scale. But I haven't seen really good, I have not yet seen like really good assessment or quantification of this. Like the decline of corporate research is a general theme that you'll hear. There was a good, by the way, if you're interested in progress in general, there's a magazine that just launched called Works in Progress, an online magazine. And Ben Southwood wrote, I just put the link in there, kind of this, wrote on this same theme, the rise and fall of the American R&D lab, and cited some evidence in there for the decline that that was convincing to me.
Are any of the big corporates, it seems like the budgets, the scale of a budget that exists at places like Google or, Tesla or SpaceX probably would dwarf a lot of the budgets of the commercial in the past. So would they sort of be described as, doing basic science research, or like, do you see that as part of science, or do you see that as more pretty direct commercialization?
Yeah, I don't know how Google's budget, by the way, compares to some of the big labs in the past. I mean, the big companies in the past were big. Like, I wouldn't underestimate that. In terms of what Google is doing, yeah. So I mean, I guess again, I mean, I haven't been following super closely, but it seems that like a lot of their contributions again have been in ML, which feels to me like a somewhat more applied. I mean, it is an academic field, but it's a somewhat more applied academic field versus, again, chemistry and optics and semiconductor physics and information theory and like some of these other things where corporate research was contributing.
Somewhere like is Tesla doing kind of fundamental research around batteries and like chemicals around that, or are they mostly applied?
I don't know, actually. Even, I mean, again, to the extent that they're doing batteries, I mean, batteries are kind of like ML in my mind. It's like again, they're not doing fundamental physics research, right? I mean, batteries are sort of more applied. And again, it is an academic field, but it's a more applied academic field. And I think that's kind of the general theme that you see, is that the corporate research has gotten more short-term focused and more applied. And there's been more of a push to maybe justify it on the basis of how is this directly kind of helping, the corporate bottom line in the near term. So.
Yeah, that actually, I think like some of Vineet's comments in the chat, and as someone who has a PhD and works at Google right now, I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts on sort of what structurally would kind of incentivize more of this research being done at these big places, or do you have any thoughts on how to improve the environment in these sorts of companies?
Are you asking me or are you asking Vineet?
Oh, I was asking Vineet if he's there as an insider.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I think a lot of the research is sort of more goal-oriented. So like, we don't do research in, let's say, mathematics, or we have small teams in algorithms, but the vast majority of our research is in machine learning and so on. And this is also true in other labs like at Facebook and Microsoft and so on. So like somebody who says that I'm going to study like complexity theory of algorithms, that would be, it would be tolerated, but it would not be somebody that we would go out and hire, like somebody who would do pure complexity theory. So I don't know how to change that. I guess one of the things that all the labs that you mentioned in the past, they were all owned by monopolies. And they had money just flowing in like crazy. And while that's true of Google and Facebook and Microsoft to some extent, but they're still not monopolies to the same extent as Bell Labs and Xerox PARC were. So at PARC, for example, there was a time when the researchers were told not to fly economy, only first class, because they just had so much money flowing in.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's been argued that part of the reason that Bell Labs not only did so much work on a wide variety of topics, but then also made a lot of their work very openly available. And even when they patented things like the transistor, they would then license those patents at a very reasonable fee. And it's been argued that part of the reason why they did that was because AT&T was a monopoly. It was a literal, like, government granted or government sort of recognized or protected monopoly. And if you read John Gertner's book, The Idea Factory, which is a good history of Bell Labs, he basically says that AT&T kind of had this, it was basically an understanding. I don't know quite how explicit versus implicit it was, but the understanding was the USA would let AT&T have its monopoly, and in return, AT&T needed to sort of be a good citizen and also give back. And one of the ways it gave back was through Bell Labs and their research. And certainly, I don't hear any tech company today say that they see their labs as you know, part of the purpose of their labs is to like generate goodwill or to give back to the world or anything like that. It would be interesting if they did see it that way. Instead, it seems more like the company makes the founder rich, and then the founder goes and puts their money into a lab or something, right? Like, you know, Chen Zuckerberg, you know, or what Gates Foundation is doing, or, you know, that kind of thing.
It seems with all these investigations now into kind of monopolies and questioning of monopolistic practices, maybe this is a good time to make that ask or to reintroduce that concept.
Maybe.
Would you also say that the, you know, increase of corporate venture capital, you know, the rise in that coincided with, you know, the lack of, you know, research, you know, labs as well? Like, why not invest in it?
That's a great point. And it's another thing that changed around mid-century, is that, you know, around late 40s and 50s is kind of when venture capital emerged as a thing, and as a new way of creating. So, you know, back in the late 1800s, you know, maybe early 1900s, around then, certainly kind of 1800s timeframes, invention was often done by individuals. And an individual inventor would sort of go off and patent something, and then they might sell it to a company to actually commercialize. And so you have this division between, you know, between the invention was done outside the corporation, and then the corporations would buy the inventions and do something with them. And then in the sort of getting into the more into the 20th century, in, you know, early to mid 20th century, then you had the rise of these corporate research labs. And so then maybe what we actually are saying is, okay, starting second half of the 20th century, we got a different model where, again, more of the innovation happens outside of the big corporations, but instead of it being with individual inventors, it's with these startup companies that are, you know, sort of more formally backed by a new type of an investor. But you know, startups themselves, I mean, the current VC model doesn't really support research. You know, it supports product development of things that have already gotten out of the research phase, typically, right? Now, I don't know, maybe we will see that change as the sort of computer and internet wave starts to mature and plateau, and investors, you know, need to seek returns in new areas. Maybe they will go more into hard tech. Maybe they will go, you know, more into things where they're much earlier in the sort of S-curve of the technology. And so maybe we'll see, you know, VCs will figure out how to invest in riskier things on longer, you know, timescales.
I know we don't have a ton more time left, but I did want to get to a little bit more about the thinking around kind of the models for how we might move and change kind of the science versus its technology gap. You know, you've sort of looked at this space a lot, and you've spent a lot of time with different organizations and people who have been thinking about this. Do you feel like you're kind of in an exploratory mode, still kind of learning or coming up with kind of trying to nail down beliefs, or do you have like specific actions that you would propose we should start taking to, you know, to sort of redefine how the funding of science and technology work? Or, you know, sort of, are we sort of in the exploration mode, or are we more in the kind of proposal making mode right now?
Yeah, I don't have any strong prescriptions yet. I don't have the answer or the, you know, or the plan. I'm still mostly in the mode of just studying what progress has even happened. Like, what does the history of progress even look like? And then what can we learn from that? I would say that, you know, like in terms of pointing to some of the causes of progress and maybe where we could think about, or even begin to think about, you know, kind of like making plans or prescriptions. I think about it on a few different levels. One is the level, a bit of a level that we've been talking about in terms of the funding. So how is progress sort of funded, organized, and managed, both at the level of science, at the level of invention, and the level of business, and sometimes, you know, those things being, you know, being integrated. And I do think that we should take a look at how research and development is financed, and whether there are, you know, whether there's something lacking in the prioritization of of kind of like where the research dollars go, whether those research dollars are flowing a little bit too much, maybe to sort of consensus or mainstream ideas, and not enough to kind of wacky, contrarian, out of the mainstream or like high risk, but potentially high reward ideas. I think there's a lot of interesting things to, potentially look at there. Another layer I would look at is kind of regulation and bureaucracy. I think that there has both in terms of like sort of government regulation and just kind of the bureaucracy surrounding every organization, both for-profit and nonprofit. I think we have accumulated a lot of rules, processes, and structure. And sometimes I wonder if we've just allowed that to sort of accumulate too far. And I think it's driven by, by a number of reasons. Part of which might be, I sometimes worry that we have sort of unwittingly traded safety for progress, and that we have accumulated rules on the basis, on sort of with the justification of safety in various forms. And I'm not even convinced that the rules are getting us safety, let alone, in an efficient way, let alone sort of, that we are making the right trade-off between safety and progress. The most fundamental thing I would look at is do we value progress? Do we think about it as a good thing? Do we have honor and prestige for the people who help drive it forward? Again, whether it's scientists, inventors, or or founders and entrepreneurs. And to what extent are we positive about progress, and or to what extent are we negative on it or fearful of it, or whatever. I think the culture has become a lot more negative on progress in the last 50 to 75 years. And I can't help but think that has to affect where young people choose to take their careers, what people choose to do within those careers, and just like the energy and the motivation that people have to go forth and make progress, which is a difficult and messy thing. The motivation that wealthier people have to fund progress and so forth. I think a lot of it comes down to the sort of fundamental cultural value that we place on it or don't. And so those would be kind of maybe the different places that I would look. Can we raise the social status of progress? Do we have the right set, can we reform the regulations and the bureaucracy around it? And can we improve how we fund, organize, and manage it? So that's kind of the general.
And I've got to guess that, when you're you've done a lot of writing and thinking and structuring and starting to hopefully start to inspire people about this. Do you have a picture of what does Roots of Progress look like on the 10-year timescale? Because presumably this would be a good foundation to inspire and sort of elevate progress to be more aspirational, to be more of a celebrated activity. How do you think about your sort of 10-year?
So on the, not totally sure about the 10-year, on the maybe 2 to 5 year timescale, I am planning to write a book. I want to write a book primarily about the history of progress. Just what has happened? How did we get here? What were the major discoveries and inventions that created the modern world? What were the problems of the daily problems of life and work that our ancestors faced in previous generations? And how were those problems solved? Right? How did we get sort of modern industrial civilization and the standard of living that we now enjoy? And I think that's the number one thing to help people just understand progress better and to better inform all of these discussions and even these debates. So that's the number one thing I want to do.
And I'm also curious about how you kind of situate that within the current political environment, like thinking about raising the status of progress. How do you think about social inequality and populism playing into that equation?
Yeah. I think one of the key questions is, have the benefits of progress been shared broadly, and have they been shared fairly? I honestly don't know if they've been shared fairly. Maybe not. Probably not in key ways. They have been shared broadly. So maybe not quite broadly enough if you think not completely fairly. But it's not. But virtually everybody today is better off than most people were 200 or so years ago. One of the key stats that surprises a lot of people is literally every country in the world today has a higher life expectancy than any country in the world did in the year 1800. The worst off country today is better off in terms of life expectancy than the best off was in 1800. So, one of the best folks on this is the late Hans Rosling of Gapminder, and he wrote a book called Factfulness. And you can look up, he's got a great 4-minute video where he sort of talks about look, there used to be back in the 60s, you could talk about the developed world and the developing world, and you could look at stats of income and life expectancy and so forth. And there's a clear gap between the West and the rest. And a lot of that has closed, not completely, but it's much more of one group now with a sort of a spectrum. If the standards of life expectancy and income that the majority of the world fell into in the 1960s, most countries have escaped that by now.
For sure. And do you think how do you think sort of this message should be communicated more broadly, especially at a time when there are so many political forces that are anti-progress in a lot of ways, kind of going back to norms that you probably would not suggest in the whole progress studies movement?
I mean, I think, again, I think the foundation is to start with the facts, start with the history. Where did we come from? What was life like in the 1700s, in the early 1800s? Why did people do these things? Why did we even, why did people work so hard to change the world? If they weren't changing it in a good direction, then what did we do this for? Was the past actually, better off than the present? Or was it equal, but just different? I think you start with the facts of history. You look at what was life like, what were the problems, and then how have things changed. And I think that story is mostly a pretty impressive story of solving an enormous number of problems and making life better in virtually every way for the vast majority of people. But again, that is if you don't believe that, and unfortunately I can't read the chat and talk at the same time, but I glance over it every once in a while and I see that a couple of people are disagreeing with me vehemently here. Sorry, we don't have time to get into all of that. But if you disagree with me, then again, start with the facts. Let's look at the facts, let's look at the history, and let's be very reality-based and empirically grounded here. And I think when my contention is that when the facts come out, that it can't help but paint progress in a very good light, because I think the facts are very favorable to it. But that's where to start. And so that's why I'm starting with the history. And that's why, I occasionally comment on, the philosophy of progress or something, but that's why I'm trying to start very much with just sort of the history and the stories and very empirical, bottom up type of approach. And that's why the first book that I want to write is not prescriptions for progress, but it's just the facts and the history, what happened.
Yep. That's great. That seems like a great starting point. So we can get a nice foundation in what has happened and try to at least make sure that we come to a common understanding around that. And then we can sort of take that to build on for kind of different understanding or beliefs about the future. So yeah, with all that, I know we are kind of running towards the end of our time here that you committed to share with us. So I'm going to first thank you for spending the time. We do have, it's been awesome to get to kind of hear you directly talk about these and to be able to chime in with our own questions. We do have one final question that we like to ask our guests, but before we close with that, I want to just make a few housekeeping announcements. So as I mentioned, thank you for participating, Jason. To everybody else who joined us and asked questions, thank you for chiming in and participating. And you can stay tuned for future town halls with our Discover page, and we'll be sharing a link in chat there so that you can sign up for some of our futures. We've got coming up, we have Scott Belsky and Annie Duke, each talking about their books. Julia DeWall is speaking about operating, Tomas Tunguz on narrative economics, and Eugene Wei on a 3-part series he's publishing on TikTok.
Great group of speakers.
Yeah, thank you. You can also stay tuned on our blog and YouTube. If you have any favorite writers who you think would be great guests on Highlighter Live, you can DM us names, and we're at Highlight Ideas on Twitter. So now for our concluding question, and it's kind of it's one that you can sort of address at whatever level of granularity you like. You already talk and think a lot about kind of the future and the big arcs. So some of these are things that you may already have sort of prepped, but we've spent the evening tonight kind of asking you questions. And so now we like to turn the tables and like to make space for you to ask us a question, and us being broadly, the world. So what are the questions or kind of the things that may be most top of mind for you, or what are you most curious about that you'd want to sort of ask the world or get feedback on? And it could be related to, the specifics of your work. It could be related to, something more trivial. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to be a world shaking thing. Sometimes it's, your favorite recent book is a good enough one.
Yeah, sure. I think if we okay, so let me put it this way. I can see that a lot of people have strong opinions about progress. If we step back from our opinions and we decide to start from a factual basis, I would love to know sort of like what are the things, what are the things that people feel that they actually don't understand about progress and would like to understand? Like what are sort of the factual questions that people have in their mind, or things that they would like to hear more about from a history type of standpoint?
Yep, that's great. That makes a lot of sense, and I think it sort of goes on with the theme of trying to understand our past so that we can sort of come to agreement on the details of the past and come to better judgment about kind of the discussions on the future. So with that, we'll make it a wrap. So thank you again, Jason, for joining us, and thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you online.
Thanks everybody. This has been
Thanks
great.
so much.
Appreciate your having me.